Welcome to Eye on Innovation, brought to you by the OIS podcast. I'm your host, Carey Powers, and I have two expert guests joining us today. We have Dr. Rishi Singh, Chief Medical Officer at the Cleveland Clinic Martin Health and Professor of Ophthalmology at the Lerner College of Medicine in Cleveland, and Dr. Michael Singer, Clinical Professor of Ophthalmology at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, and Director of Clinical Research at the Medical Center of Ophthalmology. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So we're here at OIS Retina in Seattle, and we've been hearing about truly groundbreaking advancements in the retina space. We're going to continue on with that innovation discussion, talking about how AI and robotics are advancing our learning and capabilities in retina. So let's start out by talking about diagnostics. So what can you tell us about how AI is advancing our learning in the area of diagnostics? So Dr. Singh, let's start with you.
We're going to see the first plethora of AI-related tools finally in related clinical devices. One of the things we're hoping to see this year is in some of the newer software pieces we're getting with part of the cameras, the OCT devices. They're going to have AI built into them. This is on the foundation of what we've had for years, which is the cameras that determine diabetic retinopathy and AI-related diagnostics in that area. So we're seeing those. And then as the field is advancing, we're learning more about some of the clinical trial endpoints being used with AI. Now we have automated ellipsoid zone loss, IROR to CROR conversion that we can do via AI. Obviously automation of that is going to be very helpful from the practitioner standpoint. And it really gives you a really just holistic sense of the patient. Right now, we look at a single picture without the little interpretation. And so it's left to the eye of the beholder and the way that we all interpret it, and I think that this is going to sort of give us some more ground truth and more, direct information that's going to be replicated across many different doctors and specialists who are seeing the same sort of patient.
Dr. Singer, what are you most excited about in terms of how AI is advancing diagnostics?
So I think Rishi hit on a lot of points. There's going to be a lot of change in our industry, and some of them are going to be based on the actual machines, and then some are going to be based on companies that literally are able to do different parts of the process. Within clinical trials, there are a number of different companies. There's Amorous and Macujet and DHR Pro that can essentially go into your EMR and say, I want to find a patient that fits this criteria. So for clinical trial identification for patients, that's going to be very valuable because, again, if you can find the right clinical trials, what do you end up with? You end up with better patient selection, more efficient use of trials, more cost-effective, and obviously, hopefully, better outcomes. Then the other concept is if we pivot to the clinician working, in clinic, how are these going to play out? Well, we're now going to have more and more tools that may help us in terms of making a decision on how we treat patients, looking at OCTs, looking at the different fluid compartments with the use of other, let's say, reading centers or platforms you can send it up, may be able to tell you over time, hey, look, Mrs. Jones is starting to get worse, even though you may not appreciate it by looking at CST or macular volume, that there are changes in different compartments going forward. And then the interesting thing is really going to change is the use of home OCT. Home OCT is basically technology that the patient uses at home and through artificial intelligence, able to diagnose that there's been a change in the patient's condition, maybe needing further treatment, or the patient's really stable and can stay out a little longer from your clinic.
And I was really interested in the panel earlier that you both were on, discussion about layering in genetics even to the clinical trial aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the biggest targets for us in retina right now are inherited retinal degenerations. We've gotten better at determining how we can, deliver those genes that are dysfunctional or replicate those genes that are not working properly. And thankfully, we've had an FDA-approved medication that's been out there for years, and we sort of learned a lot from that. Obviously, we need to find the right individuals for this, and thankfully, there's a lot of big programs out there, Prevent Blindness in the United States and other groups, fighting blindness groups that are out there that are genetically testing patients with inherited retinal degenerations. That data is so valuable because now we can reach out to them and say, you're the right patient for this drug or this sort of device that we have, versus before we had to wait for people to come in and be screened and then figure out the right population of patients to treat at that point.
So as AI is being integrated into medical devices, how is the FDA evaluating the algorithms that are going into that?
It's very tricky. So I was mentioning on the panel today that it requires FDA regulation of those actual algorithms. And it's not something you can do as sort of a science experiment or part of like MATLAB or something else you can just throw in there and say it works. You actually have to get these regulated, approved sort of algorithms by the FDA. And if you don't have them approved, then unfortunately they're not going to pass the muster for clinical trials. So now the race is on for a lot of these companies to submit their algorithm for automated fluid detection, for ellipsoid zone loss, for those sort of areas, photoreceptor degeneration, those sort of different endpoints that we're now seeing in the clinical studies that are the FDA is saying they're okay. But in essence, we don't have the FDA-approved algorithms to really detect that yet. So now we have to get those through before we can actually do the final endpoints.
And they require large language models. So again, any individual company has to do a lot of work to get their algorithm to the point. And Rishi made a point on the panel this morning that all these different machines, they don't really talk to each other. There's not really a uniform language. And that's going to be a real problem, because if we start running clinical trials, when it was only just the doctor deciding, hey, Clinic A had Cirrus and Clinic B had Heidelberg, it wasn't a big deal. But now as we're looking at things that are not so immediately apparent, like ellipsoid zone loss and changes over time, we got to be able to get everyone on the same platform so the FDA approves it.
Very good, very good. A very exciting time in Retina with the advent of AI. So now let's transition from AI to robotics. So what are some of the challenges that have slowed the integration of robotics into retina surgery?
Yeah, so we know that we do micro-incisional surgery. We're very different from urologists and orthopedics, as you mentioned, and they've been using robots proficiently for years. One of the big issues, and I've trained fellows for years, is the variability in surgical output and what happens. And even in the experienced surgeon, when you talk about some of these more precise delivery mechanisms, subretinal delivery or potentially other suprachoroidal delivery methods, there's a difference in all patients who are delivered this by the doctors by the biggest variable, which is the doctor. So if we can somehow automate that or make it more precise in nature from a robot, then it lends itself really to that environment quite well. And we're hoping to see technology like that. We have seen some early stage companies actually go out and say, we're attacking this and we're going to do this in this way, whether it's either suprachoroidal delivery or subretinal delivery at this given stage.
And to Rishi's point, a lot of these trials that we work on pick a handful of surgeons to use this new technology, be it subretinal or suprachoroidal. And as a general rule, the doctor in the field doesn't typically do this. So there's a huge learning curve going forward. And there's variability, like you said, to both physician and patient. And if you don't do it all the time, you're not going to end up being good at it. Even in the suprachoroidal injections we do right now, I teach a lot of doctors how to do this. And if you don't do it very often, you have to have a refresher course. The PDS, Port Delivery System spends a lot of time. They won't let you go more than 6 months without a retraining process. So again, there is a lot of variability, and the problem is we want to make sure that the results are great and reproducible over time. Having robots helping us in this process will make it a lot easier, because again, the onus won't be so much on the individual surgeon and more on the technique that it's reproducible, and you're able to do it again and again. So that'll flatten the learning curve as new people enter the system.
Which of the retina surgeries do you think will be first to integrate robotics?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more of the precise stuff that is related to suprachoroidal and subretinal delivery. That in itself, you could even imagine a time when port delivery system is delivered robotically as a way of sort of making sure that the process is done much more safer, much more precise each time, each accuracy and determining that exact length of the incision point and so on and so forth. So I think that's probably going to be the first couple in the sustained drug delivery platforms in those sort of areas first and foremost.
And to what Rishi said, especially port delivery, if you look at the port delivery system and you look at the complications over time, a lot of them have to do with conjunctival closure. And it's interesting, and as retina surgeons, we don't do a lot of conjunctival closure because that's usually in the domain of the glaucoma specialists. But again, having that process that you're able to essentially be more exact again and again and again, you'll end up with a safer procedure that not only is safe in the short term, but as we start putting implants and devices that are going to be there for the long term, that's where the difference will actually be borne out in years 3, 4, and 5, that you'll have less of these potential complications and you'll have more acceptance by both the patient and the doctor.
How may AI and imaging play a role in the robotics?
Yeah, I think one of the areas it could play a role in, and we've looked at this already, is when you do subretinal delivery, you don't know the volume at which you're delivering. And certainly, your chemical or your drug, whatever you're delivering, needs to be in a certain volume in order for you to be effective. So really measuring that volume, being able to automate the measurement process of that is going to be very, very valuable.
And the problem, and just leading right on that, in order to get the medicine in the space, you need to be in the right space. So the problem is subretinal blebs are great when they're subretinal, but if you go too deep and you're actually under the retina and you're closer to the choroid or the RPE, you're going to have sub-RPE elevation. You're going to wonder why it doesn't work. Having a way to image and know exactly where you are and have some assistance to say where the fluid's going by following it over time will hopefully be able to get you more accurate surgeries with less complications.
So how far away do you think we are from seeing robotics integrated into retina surgery?
Yeah, probably about 5 to 7 years away. It's still far away. I mean, I think that, again, I wish it was not as microsurgical in nature. These are very different situations. When I talk to my orthopedic and my urology colleagues, I tell them I'm doing something with 25 gauge, they're astounded. If I tell them 27 gauge, they're even more astounded. They're used to doing things 18 gauge, 19 gauge, large incisions, even trocar-based incisions. They're still doing that kind of work, but their trocars are much larger than ours are, for that matter, and it's a very different process altogether.
And I think to the point is we're going to probably be developed in parallel with neurosurgery, because that's where we're looking at small cannulas and small devices that I think some of their technology will probably transfer over both ways between us and them. And everything takes a while. I mean, I used to run a company and it was 4 times as long and 4 times as much. It's even much more when you're in the research space. And again, then it gets approved, and then now we have to roll it out to all these different doctors. So again, 5 to 7 years is, optimistic for, the cutting edge, but I think, rank and file, I wouldn't see it anytime soon.
So it sounds like we're nowhere near having a surgeon-less OR in the retina space.
No, not yet. I think we're still far away from there, but I think you're going to see the technology start to embed slowly. Things that are more automated, that reduce the human factors in this, and piecemeal, right? And then there'll be also the idea that we can measure volumes and do things like that in surgery, which again can be very adaptable even now. So those are going to come in quicker, but certainly the whole process of a actual physical robot with no surgeon in the room is probably hard to believe right now.
I look at it as, in terms of self-driving cars. We thought we got the whole thing down, but obviously they're dialing it back, and there are certain things that you'll be able to, you're on a freeway going straight, yes, that'll help, but as you start navigating in streets, it gets more complicated. I do think the things that you need to be reproducible over time, to Rishi's point, the volume of what you're injecting, that will help. But in terms of job security, our job security is still there. Surgeons, we're not going anywhere.
Love to hear it. All right. Well, that wraps up our time today. Thank you so much for joining us on the OIS podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning in to Eye on Innovation. I'm your host, Carey Powers.